Right. Hi, welcome to Did You Know? Today's topic in our series, Did You Know, is again an Indigenous South African topic. Something that was developed here by the people, for the people, and through the people of South Africa. The Afrikaans language. One of our 11 official languages and one that has fascinated my overseas visitors no end. Did you know that although the linguistic history of Africa as a whole is difficult to track, Afrikaans, together with Hindi, Malay, Indonesian, and Hebrew, is one of the only languages in the world that in the 20th century was standardized and became a recognized language used in all spheres of life and academics. Did you know that according to sources, the estimated total number of Afrikaans speakers worldwide ranges between 15 and 23 million? And that here in South Africa, it has the widest geographic and racial distribution of all the 11 official languages in South Africa. It is widely spoken as a mother tongue and is also widely understood as a second or third language. Even internationally prominent people like the late Tata Madiba, Trevor Noah, and Charlize Theron spoke and speak Afrikaans. In South Africa, it ranks as the third most spoken language after isiZulu and isiXhosa. And it is a recognized language in Namibia and is spoken in altogether 9 countries. Well, there are several Afrikaans words that are used internationally, like aardvark, boomslang, veld, apartheid, commando, to name just a few. But with me today is Professor Hein Willemse. He currently serves as professor in the Department of Afrikaans at the University of Pretoria and is editor-in-chief of the African literary journal Tydskrif vir Letterkunde, a journal for literature. Welcome, Professor. Did you know that Professor Willemse is, as a young academic, played an active role in the opposition of apartheid? In 1989, he attended the historical Victoria Falls Writers' Conference along with other prominent Afrikaans authors, including Andre Brink, Breiten Breitenbach, and Etienne van Heerden. Well, here, various Afrikaans intellectuals met with banned South African authors and members of the African National Congress. What an honor to have you here with us today, Professor, on Did You Know? Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Joleen.
Well, given that the linguistic history of African languages generally is not easy to track, my first question today is, how does one approach the history of Afrikaans? Is there only one history or is it more complex?
Well, I think we should take a step back, and that is to say something about language generally.
Okay.
There are about 6,000 to 7,000 languages in the world. And all of those languages, most of those languages, is a result of migration, of interaction. It's the language of economic and mercantile relationships. It's a language of war, conquest, and power, and so forth. So languages generally develop and spread as a result of those factors that I've just mentioned. I mean, we can think of the Roman Empire or Genghis Khan. And in the case of Afrikaans, it's no different. If we look at Afrikaans as a language that is the consequence of Dutch mercantilism, a commercial relationship, then I think we should also broadly understand how that whole development took place.
Mm-hmm.
If we, for instance, take into account that the Dutch, or basically a Dutch international company, a multinational company, to use that term, it's not completely appropriate, but to use that term, settled at the Cape as a result of their business in the East. And they brought together a range of people, workers from Europe, workers and slaves from Southeast Asia, workers and slaves from the African continent, and then there were the indigenous people. And it is a result of that relationship, that interaction, that we have the development of Afrikaans. For over a period of 140 years, Dutch was the language at the Cape. It was the language of commerce. It was the language of the church. And it was the language of the justice system. And as a result of that, we have these strands, various varieties of Afrikaans that came about. Perhaps, I can give you something, just an illustration of that formation. Okay, here we have the formation of Cape Dutch. If we look at that history, we can see the European migration, in this case of the company to the Cape. And if we look at that blue circle there, that's the indigenous languages that I spoke about earlier. And then we have the influences from the East, from Malaysia, from Indonesia, from the Indian subcontinent, Sri Lanka, the Mascarene Islands, Madagascar. And then we have the influences from Africa, West Africa, Central Africa, Eastern Africa, and then the Southern African languages as well. And that gives us an indication of the importance of that kind of migration that I spoke about. So if we talk about the history of Afrikaans, we have to take into account that kind of migration that I spoke about in this instance. I think we also need to take into account that because of those various languages and various influences, we all would also have different histories. So there isn't just one history, there are a complex of histories because of all those people. The indigenous people have a different history,
yes,
and a different history of migration and interaction than those people from the East who came here as slaves or as religious or political prisoners, and those from the East, from the European subcontinent who came here. We've got a different history altogether. So when we cannot just speak about history as if there is one history, there's a variety that we need to talk about.
And actually they were merging all together, and then what is the actual origin of Afrikaans then, if we've got so many histories? Is it a Creole, or is it watered down Dutch, or how do we describe Afrikaans then?
Well, given, again, perhaps just a general point, the history of all languages are histories of creolization, of hybridity. Human existence is a history of hybridity, of creolization. If we, for instance, let me take a common word. South Africans tend to have, many South Africans have a little place outside of their home where they barbecue. That thing is called a lapa. That's not an Afrikaans word, it's a Sotho word. But today we don't distinguish a lapa as a Sotho word. We have taken it and it became an Afrikaans word. So that gives us, just that one example gives us a very clear understanding of how creolization works. If we take, for instance, a number of words in Afrikaans, Eina, that's not a Dutch word. Ek, that's not a Dutch word. Eina is a Khoi word. That's a word that originated only in South African circumstances. Yeah. Ek is not ik. That's a distortion of ik, the original Dutch ik. Yeah. And so forth. So we can have a look at all those influences. The English or the Dutch don't speak about no and go. Where does that come from? Doen dat go voor mij. Do it quickly. Where does it come from?
Ik kom nou.
Ik kom nou. Where does that come from? Yeah. That is what the linguists would call reduplication. Mm-hmm. And how do we know that? Bafana. Baniana.
Yes.
So we are using reduplication as and that's a very localized way of speaking. In this case, Dutch that eventually became Afrikaans. Our word for kampong or sambreel or sambok, where do those words come from? Those are Malay words. Our words, we've got a famous dish called bobotie. Do we find that in Holland? Is that a Dutch word? That's a Malay word. Bobotie. You can walk in the streets of Kuala Lumpur and you would see kampong. And that kampong we would know in the South African labor relations environment, where workers had a particular fenced down living quarters, the kampong. A sambok, we would know, in English and in Afrikaans. That's a way of a stick to punish people, and so forth. So the histories, all our histories, of our language histories, are histories of hybridity, of creolization. We borrow words and we interchange them and we blend them and we morph between languages. And this notion of something that's pure, that comes from a particular political and ideological history, which is called social Darwinism, where there's a certain sense of purity. And that sense of purity also influences our understanding of what language is, and it distorts the histories that we're talking about. So my sense is that we also need to understand that creolization as such is a dynamic process. It's an ongoing process when we speak about language.
Yes. Well, if we think of all the new words that are currently being used, computer, etc., etc., but I always find it difficult when my German guests tell me that it sounds like Dutch, and then I'm very fiercely saying it's an independent language. It's something that is our language. So I don't know whether I was completely wrong with that, or was I just being patriotic?
No, I mean, I think that certainly, I mean, when you, it certainly, if you speak a standardized Afrikaans, the Afrikaans that was taught at school or at universities, and that when you're in the media business, you would speak a Dutch that is fairly standardized. And that's a standardized Dutch, the Afrikaans, that would be quite close to even a contemporary Dutch. It would be difficult for a person from Dutch background to understand that if it's spoken rapidly, but they would be able to pick up, because that Dutch, that Afrikaans is what I would call a re-Dutchified Afrikaans. There were certain processes in the history of Afrikaans, especially in the beginning of the 20th century, when academics and politicians and so forth tried to re-Dutchify Afrikaans. It had to look and sound like Dutch. So this Dutchification was a process that happened. The Germification of Afrikaans was certainly a process that took place and shaped the Afrikaans that we have today as standardized Afrikaans. But when you look at spoken Afrikaans, if you look at the spoken Afrikaans of people in the Cape, in other parts, other varieties, that's a very different kind of Afrikaans. I suspect that someone would look at a spoken Afrikaans in, for instance, the Cape, would have great difficulty understanding what has been said, simply because the language, the sound itself, has been influenced by South Asian languages, and that influenced a different type of Afrikaans. The J and Joe, that comes from Southeast Asia. Samosa and Barakat and Meningal and so forth. I suspect that when somebody north of the Vaal River hears all those words, he or she would not understand what I just said. Because all those words are Afrikaans words, but those are words of Southeast Asian heritage and ancestry. So one needs to also make that distinction between the kind of formalized, standardized,
academic Afrikaans, yeah, almost academic Afrikaans.
The spoken Afrikaans as well.
Right.
So that's very different, I think.
But so, in other words, what you were saying is that today Afrikaans still develops, or is it a dying language, like some people are saying?
No. Languages don't just die. They morph into something else. They change if there are interactions and people speak the language. It changes. I mean, if I compare the language that we speak today from the Afrikaans that we spoke 30 years ago, it's very different, even in this short period of time. If I listen to the young people that I taught at university, or still teaching at university, I find that most of those students, when they speak to me, who speaks a standardized Afrikaans in class, and they have to respond, they often say, I don't understand what you're saying.
Really?
Because what the language that they are speaking is local youth slang. There's an overemphasis on the usage of English words and terminology. They do not understand often the more formalized, standardized Afrikaans, and they have great difficulty in understand where they're coming from, simply because their experience of Afrikaans as a formal academic language is quite limited. So that happens in schools and university, but one needs to understand that words like these words do not just, or the changes in language do not just happen instantaneously. It happens because there are processes behind it. Our children are more
international, maybe, yeah, exactly, yeah.
Actually connected.
Yeah.
Their worldview and experience of language is probably more international, and especially English international rather than Chinese or Spanish or Arabic international. So one needs to take that into account.
Yeah. I always smile when I think of Hein Willemse, who called that Afrikaans with lots of English words seminary Afrikaans. People at that stage wanted to prove that they can also speak English, which I sometimes find quite humorous.
Yeah, but I don't think one should be judgmental about that. The point about language is so organic, and we politicians and linguistic nationalists want to point us in a particular direction. This is the way it should be spoken, and we shall speak it in this way. We in Afrikaans studies certainly had a lot of that at school. This is not the proper way of saying it. This is the proper way of saying it. And you would know that in class you speak a particular way, and outside of class you speak in a different way. That is the process. That is, you write differently than you speak often, and so forth. So, but we also have to understand, I think, these varieties, and often we don't understand the histories that we look at. The histories of language, of Afrikaans particularly, is a very interesting one. And if we look at modern Afrikaans, all of those histories come together. Yeah. I wanted to say something about those varieties, and I forgot about it earlier.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, if we look at the varieties of Afrikaans, often we have this one example of the Genootskap vir Regter Afrikaners, the society of the right Afrikaners. And that is often the story that is told to everyone, as if it's the only story. But that is one history. That's one part of that history. If I give you another, let me give you an example of 5 different histories.
Yes.
Just to illustrate that. So here we have the history of the GRA as one story about Afrikaans. There's also another story, or for instance, the Oorlands people. Those were the people who were indigenous Khoi people, who learned Dutch, mixed it with their own indigenous Khoi languages, and trekked through the hinterland of the Cape into Namibia, into what we today know as Kimberley or the Northwest. Yeah. That's one story. There's one history. There's a history of the trekboere, the trekboers. Yeah. Europeans who moved into the hinterland. That's another history altogether. There's the history, for instance, of the mission stations, Genadendal, Longray, and Elam, and those places at the Cape, where the earliest mission station in South Africa is called Genadendal. Yes. And George Schmidt started it, and he left, but it retained the status of a mission station. And it was at one point as important as Cape Town was at that time.
If not more important, yes. Culturally. Yes.
Yeah. And those people there developed their own newspaper, yes, called the Huisvriend. And at one point, some of those people said, "Oh, we hear that the people in Paarl are starting out something called Afrikaans, which is the same as the language that we speak here and write here." And they were writing their own history or their own stories, yes, in the Moravian Church. And so that's another history. That's another leg of this history that we speak about. And then there's also something that's probably be interesting to your peer, the people who visit your website, would be the history of Arabic Afrikaans.
Yes.
Afrikaans written in the Arabic script. Now, let me give you an example of that. If we look here, that was, if the yellow dot there would be Afrikaans or Dutch at the Cape. But then it progressively, people migrated and they took the language to the rest of the country, or what became the country later on. If you take the trekboere and the Oorlands people, the indigenous people, those who later became known as Griquas and Rielbotters and so forth, they took the language to those parts of the country, to Namibia, for instance. Afrikaans in Namibia didn't arrive there because of white imperialism or the Afrikaners. It came in Namibia because of the Oorlands people and the Rielbott people who trekked from these parts into Namibia. If we look at this history here, that was the history of moving into the Eastern Cape, again by the trekboers or the trekboere. And those people that we know today as the San and the Khoi people, especially the Khoi people. And then we have the trek north by the Voortrekkers, for instance. and their companions. And these were the people who moved into that direction. So this is just one illustration of that language spread that I spoke about earlier. So Afrikaans just didn't arrive at one point, you know, I was still saying about the various histories of Africa.
Okay.
And something that might be interesting for people who do not necessarily know the intricate histories of Afrikaans. I spoke about these various histories and people that came. One group of people that came were people from Southeast Asia, and they brought along, many of these people were literate. These slaves were literate. They were not illiterate, but they were literate in their languages. They were mostly Muslims. Many of them were Muslims. They wrote in Arabic script. Some of them were Tamils from the Asian subcontinent and so forth. So those languages all came to South Africa and influenced the local environment. If I give you one example, for instance, of Arabic Afrikaans text, the example that I'm going to show you is a text from 1869,
okay,
which is one of the first Afrikaans texts, in whether it's in Roman script or in Arabic script. There are two texts that are quite important in the terms of the history of Afrikaans. The one is called the Betrouwbare Woord, of which we don't have a copy. I know that we don't have a copy that's accessible to us. And I know that in Indonesia there's a copy supposed to be at the University of Pretoria, which we can't find. And then there's the Bayan Uddin, which is an introduction to religious practices.
And both were written in Arabic. And both were written in Arabic.
It's Afrikaans written in Arabic script. So some of the texts some of these Arabic Afrikaans texts, one of them, the one that we have access to, is called the Bayan Uddin. It has been written by a Turk, somebody who was Ottoman, who came to the Cape. It's a long history, but he was here to teach the local Muslim adherents some of the practices and traditions of Islam. And now this text was, and I'll show it to you. Do you see that?
Oh, yes, yes.
So this is Abu Bakr Effendi's, this is the second page, I think, if I'm correct, of the Bayan Uddin. This is Afrikaans.
It's amazing.
It's an Arabic script, and this was the text that some Muslim adherents at the Cape used to teach them about the practices of the religion. On the right-hand side, in my case, you've got the more contemporary Afrikaans text, also written in Arabic. That's from about the 1960s and so forth. So the important part of this history is that this is another history, an important part, a puzzle in this broader history of the Afrikaans language. Let me give you an example of these Afrikaans in Arabic script. This is an Arabic script from 1860.
Oh, okay.
So this is probably some of the this is without doubt the earliest Afrikaans that you would have written in this form. And let me give you an example of what it says. Read what it says. In Cape Dutch, and I'll read the Cape Dutch and then you can follow the modern Afrikaans. But also listen and try and find out whether you'll be able to hear contemporary Afrikaans. Waarlik, u is geprys en is gegroet. Ja, Allah vermeerder u barmhartigheid op Mohammed en op zijn familie, net zoals u gedaan het op Nadib Ibrahim. You would be able, you hear, that's old Afrikaans, 1860 Afrikaans. If we translate it into contemporary Afrikaans, I've done that on the other side of the slide, and you'll be able to read the modern Afrikaans. But you would have heard the original. And if we look, just for those of your viewers who are English speaking, I've given you the English version of the translation of it. Truly thou art praised and elevated, O God, increase thy blessings on Muhammad and his family, just as thou had done for Prophet Abraham. So that gives one an understanding of this history that we're talking about. So this particular history and these histories that we have about Afrikaans is often told as if there is just one history, and that's the history of the GRA, the Genootskap vir Regter Afrikaners. But we've got all these different histories that we also need to talk about, that we also need to take into account once we start speaking about Afrikaans.
Yes.
The difficulty about Afrikaans often is that because of this one history that has been told to not only to South Africans and to Afrikaans speakers, but to everybody else, people look at Afrikaans as a one-dimensional language, a language, for instance, of the oppressor, or the language of white people. If we take into account that 6 out of 10 Afrikaans speakers are not white.
Yes, exactly.
Afrikaans is a language spoken primarily by people who are not white. It's a black language, so to speak.
Yes, yes.
In ordinary, simple South African terms. It's spoken, that is the majority of Afrikaans speakers come from backgrounds that have very little to do with Europe. And so that's the problem with political ideology, that it tells one story only.
Yeah, that's why it's a pity. I mean, because I remember when I visited the Afrikaans Taal Monument in Paarl in the 1970s, end of 1970s, it was not used at all by people that are in the area that should actually visit it. But it has changed, because now the Afrikaans language monument, which was very politicized in the 70s, is now open to all. And it is absolutely wonderful to see that all South Africans actually now visit the monument and are proud of their language, which it has changed. I mean, that's the good news.
No, it has changed, and I think in that sense it's correct that people are reclaiming the language in different ways. But it's the history that we also look at, because this history has also found a certain process of legitimation in linguistic theory, for instance. There are 3 broad theories about Afrikaans, the origins of Afrikaans. The one theory is what they call the spontaneous development of Afrikaans, which essentially says that Afrikaans spontaneously developed from Dutch varieties, and that it's essentially a European language. But this was the story that was sold to South Africans and schools, children at school, at university students for much of the 20th century. If you look back at schooling up to the 1970s, even 80s, this was the main theory that was sold to people. But that is probably not the best theory. It's probably not the correct theory, because it was so heavily influenced by ideological principles. The language of creolization, or the theories of creolization, are closer to the truth, probably. It says that second language speakers of Dutch influenced Dutch, and that became Afrikaans. And then there's a third theory that says that might be true about second language speakers, but people who had a greater influence were the workers and the slaves and the indigenous people, because these were the people who had no sense of, they could not speak Dutch. They had to form it and reform it and revitalize it for themselves to make sense. If we look at languages like Vaningalo, for instance, it's the workers who influence the language and change it. So this third theory or the second theory of creolization then says that the indigenous people, the substratist influences on the language of Dutch played a major role. So today we more or less accept that Afrikaans is this product of these processes of creolization, whether it's second language speakers or whether it is local languages and the slave languages. So those histories that we are talking about are probably the histories that I think one should look at it when you look at the history of Afrikaans today.
This is the histories, and when we look at today, unfortunately, it is again. It looks like it is again politicized from a different angle, maybe. But just briefly, what is the situation today of Afrikaans being used at academic institutions, for instance?
Well, the position of Afrikaans has weakened over the past 30 years, considerably so. And again, as you said, it's because it's a process due to the politics of the time, the changes in the socio-political environment. And that will continue. We'll have those pressures from various positions within the political and social environment. My own understanding of these kind of processes often is that they are not just one-dimensional and one-directional, they're unidirectional, they are multidirectional. So while on the one hand you've got a political process that tries to encapsulate a particular kind of political paradigm, you have other processes happening at the same time. People are reclaiming Afrikaans in spaces that they didn't have, where those places weren't there previously. People in the Cape, for instance, are using it for political and cultural purposes in ways that they haven't used it in the 1980s.
Yes.
There are processes happening of Afrikaans-specific institutions, whether they agree with it or not, that have a certain process of development. If you look at media, for instance, and the internet, and you look at music and cultural festivals and so forth, there are processes happening there which are not necessarily happening in other Southern African languages.
Right. And
the reason for that is because of the tension between the current political environment and the cultural and social cultural environment. So you've got pressures that are multidimensional happening because people want to secure a place for their language. They are reclaiming it in ways that the state do not necessarily understand. So language is always organic. It's not something that you can easily
just confined to a specific, right.
Confined to a political process only.
Yeah.
The political and educational and judicial environment play an important role. But all of these other processes are always taking place at the same time.
Yep.
So one need to take that into account. So if you look at the media, for instance, if you look at the arts and so forth, those developments are taking place. It's a far more vibrant environment than it has been 40 years ago, when the language was confined and determined by the political environment. Right now, it has There's a certain sense of liberty and freedom around the position of Afrikaans, which it hasn't had for much of early 20th century.
Well, Professor, this was absolutely fantastic to speak to you today. I'm passionate about Afrikaans. It is my mother tongue, but it is something that I always absolutely love to share with visitors from overseas. So having your insight today was very precious. So I want to really thank you for this time. I learned a lot, and I'm sure everybody else who watched this also learned a lot.
Thank you very much, Julie.
Thank you. My dad, whose mother tongue was German, he always said that there is not a language like Afrikaans that gives in so few words so much meaning and so much expression. And I would just actually like to end this program with an example of just exactly that. There is, by the way, a German translation of this Boerneef poem. It explains it, but to my mind, it doesn't quite cut it. And here is the poem. Die najaar is nou op sy herfste. Die bessieboom se rooi is hart van rooi. Hoe het my jeug se oë dan gekyk? Die kleur was toe mos nie so brandend rooi. Is dit die gawe van die ouderdom? Om dieper in die kleure gloed te kyk, aanhoudender na ondergaande son? That's it.